All right. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the first day of the Young Philosophers Lecture Series. This is the intro talk day. I'll spare you the spiel that I gave the first crew, but I'll give you the short version. Please turn off cell phones. We videotape all of these and put them up at, well, you can't see it, but youngphilosophers.org. You can actually check out videos of all the talks, intro and research level talks. We also have 2 intro level talks happening here this afternoon from 2:20 to 3:50, so please join us for that if you're interested. Without further ado, I'll get to introducing our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Samuel Kahn. He's actually an assistant professor at IUPUI, right up the road from us. Before joining the faculty at IUPUI, he was working on his PhD. He finished his PhD in philosophy at Stanford University in 2012. His research interests include ethics and Kant, particularly Kantian ethics, and he's going to be talking today about lethal injection and asking the question, what's the big deal about lethal injection? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Samuel Kahn.
Thank you. Okay, so my name's Samuel Kahn, and the name of my talk today is What's the Big Deal with Lethal Injection Anyway? And I want to start just by saying a little bit about what I'm going to be doing and what I'm not going to be doing and why I'm going to be taking the approach that I do. So there are 2 big things that I'm not going to be doing in this talk. One is presenting an argument for or against capital punishment in general. And the other is presenting an argument for or against lethal injection as a method of carrying out capital punishment. What I want to do in this talk is just introduce you to some of the main talking points that have evolved in the socio-political sphere in the last 10 or 15 years or so about capital punishment. And the way that about lethal injection. And the way that I'm going to do that is by talking about some of the other methods that are used for carrying out capital punishment, currently legal in the United States. Talking a little bit about the history that has led up to the so-called modern period of capital punishment in the United States, and then focusing on some of the problems that arise with regard to lethal injection in particular. And my reasons for taking that approach are twofold. For one thing, I think it's really difficult to understand the current socio-political context, the dialectic that's going on these days with regard to lethal injection in particular and capital punishment in general, if you don't have some of the history of capital punishment over the last 20, 30 years or so under your belts. And the other, I think, deeper reason for taking this approach is that the closing question that I'm going to ask, I want you to think about not in the abstract, but rather in the concrete here and now, what you would be comfortable with. So to illustrate what I mean by that, I'm hoping that when you think about capital punishment, you won't just think about it in the abstract. Do I think it's okay that some person out there, some nameless, bodiless person out there is going to kill some other person when that other person commits a heinous act? But that you'll think about whether you, yourself, would be comfortable, say, as the executioner. Would you be able to pull that trigger if you were on the firing squad and execute that person? Would you be able to throw the switch if you're the state electrician and electrocute that person? And not just from the perspective of the executioner, but also from the perspective, say, of the family members of the victims. Imagine yourself as a parent, and your son or daughter is brutally raped and murdered before your eyes. What would you want to happen to the perpetrator of that heinous act? One of the things we've learned from ethicists, from cognitive scientists, from psychologists over the last 10 or so years, or maybe longer than that, is that one of the ways in which we form our considered moral judgments is by thinking ourselves into other situations, using our moral imaginations, trying to figure out how we would feel in those situations, and then using that information to inform our considered moral judgments. And my hope is that by giving you the details in this way of the other methods of capital punishment and some of the history of capital punishment, I'll be able to make those thought experiments more vivid for you. Okay. Now, I originally was going to begin with some of the history of capital punishment in America, I think I'm going to skip over that for the interests of time. I just want to say two quick things. One is that capital punishment in the colonies in America, of course, was inherited from England. The first execution was in 1608. Between 1608 and today, there have been somewhere between 20,000 and 23,000 government-sanctioned executions. And the other thing that I want to say about this is that you have to remember that there aren't merely different state death penalty systems, of which there are many. There's also a federal death penalty system that's separate from that. And there's a US military death penalty system that's entirely separate from that. And this does have some counterintuitive results. For example, this might mean that somebody could be indicted of and convicted of a capital crime and ultimately sentenced to death in a state that doesn't actually have the death penalty, as recently happened in the case of the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. And I want to fast forward straight to talking about the methods that are currently legal in the United States. And the first one that I want to talk about is hanging. So hanging is currently legal. It was last used in 1996 in the case of Billy Bailey in Delaware. It is the most frequently used method of execution in the history of America. It accounts for roughly 60% of American executions. If somebody is going to be executed by means of hanging today, then a day or two before the execution, his or her height and weight will be measured, because they want to ensure that the drop isn't too short. If the drop is too short, then the person is going to die by strangulation. If the drop is too long, risks having the head severed from the body. They want what's called a standard drop. Not too short, not too long. On the day of the execution, the person is escorted into the room with the apparatus. Hands, feet are bound, blindfold, or a hood is placed over the head. Noose is placed around the neck with the knot behind the left ear. That's a very important detail because when the person is dropped, the idea is to have their head jerked backwards, severing the spinal column. Assuming all goes well, death takes between 5 and 10 minutes. Electrocution is the second most frequently used method in American execution history. It accounts for roughly 30% of American executions. It is almost unique to the United States. The only other place in the world where electrocution has been used as an official government-sanctioned method of execution is in the Philippines, which adopted it in 1924 when they were under US occupation. It was last used in the Philippines in the 1970s, last used in the United States in 2013 in Virginia in the case of Robert Gleason. And it is still legal in certain jurisdictions under certain circumstances today. The electric chair has a really fascinating history. Just a quick portrait of what that looks like. It was developed at the end of the 19th century at the height of the so-called current wars. Those of you familiar with the current wars will know that that was when Westinghouse and Edison were battling it out to see whether our power grids would be delivering electricity to us by means of alternating current or direct current. And during the course of the current wars, Edison publicly electrocuted, executed by means of electrocution, a lot of animals in order to show that alternating current is so much more deadly than direct current, and so we should be having direct current rather than alternating current in our power grids. Well, Westinghouse won the current wars, but out of this was born the idea of the electric chair, which in fact functions by means of alternating current. The first person executed by the electric chair in the United States was William Kemmler, executed for premeditated murder in New York. He challenged his sentence on Eighth Amendment grounds. More on that in a moment. For now, all you need to know is that he lost. He was executed in 1890. The Supreme Court ruled against him. If somebody is sentenced to die by, if somebody is going to be executed by means of electrocution today, they are escorted into the room on the execution day. They are strapped down to the electric chair. A saline solution-soaked sponge is placed on their head. A metal skull cap is placed over that. A leather mask is placed over their face. A portion of their left leg will have been shaved. Conductant jelly is placed on that. And another electrode is placed over the conductant jelly. After the first jolt of electricity goes through the person, medical doctors wait for the body to cool down, determine whether it's dead, repeat if necessary. Death usually takes between 2 and 15 minutes, assuming that all goes well. Now, with hanging and electrocution taking account for approximately 90% of American executions, it should be unsurprising that the other methods fall far below that in terms of the frequency of their use. Gas chamber is being used in approximately 4% of American executions. The gas chamber also has a really fascinating history, beginning in America, then, at least according to some historians, being the inspirations for the Nazi gas chambers used in the Holocaust. It was developed in the first half of the 20th century. After World War I, people were looking around for a new, more humane method of execution. They were interested in chemical warfare because this had been used in World War I. And the first person executed by means of the gas chamber was G. John in 1924 in Nevada. It is still legal in certain jurisdictions in the United States under certain conditions. It was last used in 1999 in Arizona in the case of Walter Legrand. If somebody is going to be executed by means of gas chamber, they are escorted into the gas chamber on the day of the execution, strapped down to a chair. A long stethoscope is attached to their body. The stethoscope goes to outside the gas chamber so that physicians can determine whether the person is alive or dead. After everybody has left the gas chamber is sealed, a fan turns on, evacuates some of the air from the gas chamber. A spigot is opened from outside the gas chamber, allowing sulfuric acid that's being prepared outside the gas chamber to flow into a bucket underneath that chair where the prisoner is sitting. Once the sulfuric acid has flown in, the spigot is closed, and a switch triggers the release of sodium cyanide tablets that are underneath that chair to fall into the sulfuric acid, releasing cyanide gas into the chamber. The prisoner is instructed to breathe deeply in order to expedite unconsciousness. Death usually takes between 15 and 20 minutes, assuming all goes well. The fourth and last method of lethal injection that I'm going to talk about before I talk a little bit about the history leading up to the modern period where lethal injection plays such a prominent role is firing squad. Firing squad is still legal in the United States. It was the first method used in the United States, the earliest recorded, actually not in the United States, in American soil, the earliest recorded execution in the colonies was done by firing squad. It accounts for roughly 1% of American executions. Last used in 2010 to execute Ronnie Lee Gardner in Utah. Somebody's going to be executed by firing squad on the day of the execution. They're led into the room, strapped down to a chair which has sandbags behind it. Hood is placed over the head. A white target is pinned on the chest. There are 5 shooters, about 25 feet away. They stand behind a canvas. They use .30 caliber rifles. 4 of them have live cartridges. 1 of them has a wax cartridge. They used to use empty cartridges, but it turns out that people who are experienced with guns can determine the difference between a live cartridge and an empty cartridge, so they switch over to wax cartridges. In current day America, if somebody's going to be executed by means of firing squad, the shooters are actually recruited volunteers, usually from local police forces. There's some really interesting interviews that have been published of the people who participate in on these firing squads. And if you're curious, I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A or afterwards. Death is supposed to be relatively instantaneous with a firing squad. There are other methods that have been used in American history, including breaking on the wheel, including burning alive, government-sanctioned executions, and one instance of pressing. Those of you who are familiar with the Salem witch trials know the name of Giles Corey, know his famous last words, more weight, apocryphal, anyway. That was him. It's unclear whether that was really an official execution. There are some details about that case that I'd be happy to talk about either during the Q&A or afterwards. If you guys are curious, if there's time, I could just bore you with it afterwards. Anyway, I want to switch now into some of the history leading up to the modern period. And we have to go back a little bit, backtrack to the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment was ratified in 1791, part of the Bill of Rights. It states that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor, for our purposes, the most important part here, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Now, it turns out that this cruel and unusual clause was actually copied from the English Bill of Rights, which was ratified about 100 years ago, 100 years before this. As philosophers, we read this and we're probably thinking, well, okay, that sounds nice, but what does it mean? What actually counts as cruel and unusual punishment? If we were to take a historical interpretation of what this means, one thing that we can be relatively certain of is that cruel and unusual punishment did not rule out capital punishment. The reason we can be relatively certain of this is that in the Fifth Amendment, which was ratified at the same time, there are actually 3 explicit references to capital punishment, one of which gives instructions for how it ought to be meted out, namely with due process, indicating not only that the writers of these amendments didn't think that capital punishment was cruel and unusual, but they actually expected it to be used. Similarly, in the 14th Amendment, ratified about 100 years after this, after the Civil War, there's also a reference to capital punishment, also giving instructions with regard to how it should be carried out, namely with due process. In the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided a number of important cases in the opinions of which they declared that firing squad was not cruel and unusual, hanging was not cruel and unusual, electrocution, this was William Kellner's case, although certainly unusual, is not cruel, and therefore is not cruel and unusual. According to the Supreme Court prior to the 20th century, the cruel and unusual punishment clause was intended to rule out things like physical torture, things that might cause a lingering and painful death. But all of this changed in the 20th century with a landmark non-capital case in 1910, Weems versus the U.S. Just quickly, a sort of précis of that case. Weems was a Coast Guard officer. He was working in the port of Manila. He had entered in 2 entries into the official logbook in the port of Manila incorrectly. It said people had been paid out a certain sum of money, even though actually they hadn't. According to the accounts I've read of it, these sums of money were inconsequential. $2,015, it was about $3 on one occasion, $6 or $7 on another occasion. But because this was an official logbook, he was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. He had a fine slapped on him and a few other things. He challenged this penalty. He argued that given the nature of his crime, the penalty was cruel and unusual. The case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided in his favor. There's no physical torture here. Nothing that was going to be causing a long and painful, lingering death. They decided in his favor, nonetheless, and they stated explicitly that the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual part of the Eighth Amendment, needed to be interpreted in terms of the evolving standards of decency of a society, advocating a so-called ahistorical interpretation of the Eighth Amendment. Now, there are all sorts of worries about what happens when you start advocating for an ahistorical interpretation of the amendments of the Constitution. I'm not going to get into those. Suffice to say that this ahistorical interpretation that the Supreme Court was advocating was then reaffirmed in later non-capital cases, establishing a very strong precedent, and also, as you might imagine, establishing a precedent ultimately for a challenge to capital punishment on Eighth Amendment grounds. Now we need to put that piece of the puzzle down, pick up another seemingly unconnected piece of the puzzle, and then I'm going to tie these 2 pieces back together in just a second. And the seemingly unconnected piece of the puzzle that we need to pick up is the movement away from so-called mandatory death penalty sentencing laws. So prior to the 1830s, mandatory death penalty sentencing laws were sort of the norm. And what does that mean? What is a mandatory death penalty sentencing law? Well, that states that if you are convicted of a capital crime, then you are going to be sentenced to death. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Game over. Starting in the 1830s, states began to move away from these and towards so-called discretionary death penalty statutes, which stated that if you are convicted of a capital crime, then the jury has a further decision. First, they decide whether you're guilty of that capital crime. Then they decide what sentence is appropriate. Should they sentence you to death, or should they sentence you to life in prison? Okay. Now, this movement began in the 1830s, extended well into the 20th century, but by the 1960s, more and more evidence was accumulating that the death penalty was being meted out in a racially discriminatory fashion. And in 1972, the Supreme Court decided another landmark case, which we're just going to call Furman for our purposes. The Furman case is really complicated. It was a 5-4 decision. There are 9 Supreme Court justices, and the decisions are, decided by majority rules. It was a 5-4 decision. There were 9 opinions written about it. Really fractious decision. But one strand of thought that legal scholars often read back into Furman is that the discretionary death penalty sentence laws resulted in arbitrary and capricious sentencing on the part of juries, and that the result was in violation of the Eighth Amendment. Cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the backlash against Furman, which happened in 1972, was immediate and widespread. Gallup polls indicated that about 66% of the American population was in favor of capital punishment. It was high. Officials began writing amicus curiae briefs to the court saying, please overturn your decision. Congresspeople began grouping together saying, well, maybe we should amend the U.S. Constitution officially to explicitly reinstate capital punishment. And the states went back and began rewriting their death penalty statutes in order to get around the objections that were raised in Furman by the Supreme Court. And in 1976, the Supreme Court decided another landmark case, Gregg. Again, Gregg is a very complicated case, but the basic take-home message that we need to know is that the Supreme Court said that guided discretionary death penalty statutes were okay. So, guided discretion death penalty statutes, according to the Supreme Court, struck a nice balance between mandatory death penalty statutes on the one hand, which don't allow jurors to consider relevant differences between individual cases, and unfettered discretionary death penalty statutes on the other side, which result in arbitrary and capricious sentencing, which is in a violation of the Constitution. So the important take-home message of this is what the Supreme Court was telling us is that there's nothing inherently cruel and unusual about capital punishment, not even on the ahistorical understanding of cruel and unusual. We just have to be careful about the way in which we carry it out. And this is what ushered in the modern period of capital punishment. And a lot of different stories have unfolded in the modern period. Stories about the appeals process, which you guys have probably heard about because it's been in the news a lot recently, with a few cases of people who have been executed after spending decades on death rows. Stories about aggravating conditions, stories about mitigating conditions, stories about effective counsel, all sorts of stories. But the one that we're going to focus on is now lethal injection. Lethal injection was first legalized in Oklahoma in 1977 at the beginning of the modern period of capital punishment. It was first used in Texas in 1982 in the case of Charles Brooks Jr. It is the most used method in the modern period. That being said, it accounts for only just over 4% of all American executions, slightly more frequently used than the gas chamber in the history of American executions. Now, if somebody is sentenced to die by means of lethal injection, if somebody is going to be executed by means of lethal injection, on the day of the execution, they are strapped down to a gurney. Different states have different kinds of gurneys. Some of them have a hospital bed like gurney, in which case the arms are by the side. Some of the gurneys have wings, in which case the arms are going to be out like this. Once the person is strapped down, straps over the lower legs, upper legs, abdomen, chest, arms. An IV is started once electrodes have been placed on the chest so that they can monitor the heartbeat. The optimal placement of the IV is in the left arm. More on that in a moment. Many states will, in optimal conditions, establish 2 IVs, one in the left arm, one in the right arm. Sometimes this is just a precautionary measure in case something goes wrong with the IV. Sometimes it's because they want to deliver the drugs in an alternating fashion, drug 1 in the left arm, drug 2 in the right arm, drug 3 in the left arm. Sometimes they deliver all 3 drugs simultaneously through both arms. Drug 1, both left and right arm, drug 2, both left and right arm, so on. States have different methods of delivering these drugs. Some states have a machine where you press the button and then the drugs start flowing. Some states use 3 executioners. Each one is responsible for depressing a syringe for each one of the drugs. And one of the syringes is diverted to a dummy bag each time, and of course they don't know which one. The standard protocol, prior to quite recently, was a 3-drug protocol. The first drug is a barbiturate, sodium thiopental, meant to induce unconsciousness. More on that in a moment. Second drug, pancuronium bromide. This is supposed to induce paralysis, stop the prisoner from breathing. And the third drug is potassium chloride, which is supposed to stop the prisoner's heart. Once the IV has been started, the procedure usually takes between 5 and 35 minutes, assuming all goes well. Once the drugs have been delivered, death usually takes between 5 and 10 minutes, assuming all goes well. And now we get into the problems. Now, it's sometimes claimed that lethal injection is the most botched method of execution in American history. I think that claim is somewhat misleading for at least 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned already, lethal injection is the most frequently used method of execution in the modern period. And 2, the standards for what counts as a botched execution in the modern period are different from what the standards were, say, 100 years ago. The so-called standard drop for hanging, which is supposed to execute by means of breaking the neck, really wasn't developed until the 19th century. And it's probably safe to say that many people who were executed before that time by means of hanging died by strangulation, which by today's lights would be considered a botched execution, but wouldn't have been back then. That being said, lethal injection is marked by the fact that there are so many steps along the process where it faces problems. And the first problem actually begins prior to the actual execution itself. It begins just with the acquisition of the drugs. Before about 2009, a lot of states were acquiring their drugs from a company called Hospira, an American company. But Hospira was manufacturing, in particular they were acquiring their barbiturates from this company. But Hospira was manufacturing their sodium thiopental in Italy, a plant based in Italy. The Italian parliament objected to this. In 2009, Hospira shut down its plant, stopped manufacturing these drugs at this plant. 2011, they stopped selling it. Because of this, Georgia and various other states began acquiring their drugs from a wholesale distributor in London called Dream Pharma. Turns out that there are some legal problems with acquiring drugs, and in particular barbiturates, in this way. In 2011, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, seized Georgia's stockpile of barbiturates. Later that year, various other states voluntarily gave over their stockpiles to the DEA. In response to these problems, various states like Oklahoma have begun using different drug cocktails. Oklahoma has begun using pentobarbital. It's another barbiturate. It's supposed to do the same thing as sodium thiopental. The main difference is that pentobarbital is widely used in the US for euthanizing animals, so it's much more widely available. But the problems don't stop there, because many pharmaceutical companies and many pharmacies are unwilling to provide these drugs to state officials if they know that these drugs are going to be used for capital punishment, because they don't want to be associated with a divisive practice that might lose them capital on the market. The take-home message is just that getting these drugs turns out to be kind of difficult. But the real problems with lethal injection begin once the execution starts. And the first one, there's problem 2 here, is with regard to the delivery method. So the delivery method is by means of an IV. There are all sorts of places in which things can go wrong here. There's the sorts of standard problems that happen with IVs, as illustrated in the case of Raymond Landry, who was executed in Texas in 1998. He had a so-called blowout event. So the execution team established the IV, went back, getting ready to deliver the drugs, and the IV blew out of his vein. The execution team then had to go back in, restart the whole procedure, which, as you might imagine, is not a particularly pleasant experience for anybody involved. On top of that, various very influential medical organizations like the American Medical Association explicitly have requested that their members not take part in these procedures beyond declaring the prisoner dead at the end of them. Now, some states have tried to get around these problems by writing laws that state, for example, that no physician may have his or her license stripped from him or her simply for participating in these procedures. Nonetheless, it remains the case that it is difficult to recruit highly trained physicians and nurses to participate in these procedures, and the people who are administering and monitoring the IVs might not be the most highly skilled phlebotomists around. This can be illustrated in cases like that of Angel Diaz, who was executed in Florida in 2006. The IV pierced his vein. The drugs ended up being delivered to the soft tissue surrounding his vein, resulting in really painful chemical burns, reduced efficacy of the barbiturate, and increased time for the other drugs to take effect. And on top of all of that, many of the people who are being executed have damaged their veins from years of serial IV drug use, which means that it might be very difficult to find a viable place where one can start an IV, as illustrated in the case of Rommel Broom, who was scheduled to be executed in Ohio in 2009, but after 2 hours of sticking and resticking and resticking and resticking and resticking and resticking, trying to establish a viable IV, Ted Strickland, the governor of Ohio, called in, issued a temporary week-long reprieve, during which time Broom's lawyers said, look, if he's subjected to this again, this is going to be cruel and unusual punishment, and he remains on Ohio's death row to this day. But even if the drugs were readily available, the delivery system were flawless, the third problem is perhaps the most disturbing, which is that there are worries about the efficacy of these drugs, and in particular about the efficacy of the barbiturate, which is the drug that's supposed to ensure that the procedure is in fact humane, that the prisoner is not going to be aware of what's going on during this process. Anesthesiologists repeatedly have voiced the objection that there is no guarantee that the barbiturate is not going to wear off during this procedure, resulting in the prisoner being aware of what's going on, but not being able to say anything or do anything because she or he is going to be paralyzed from the pancuronium bromide. In fact, a study published in 2005 in The Lancet of 4 death penalty states revealed that toxicology reports, according to the toxicology reports from these states, in approximately 90% of cases, prisoners had barbiturate levels lower than that required for surgery. And in approximately 40% of these cases, the prisoners had barbiturate levels consistent with awareness. As states have shifted to different drug cocktails, the one thing that has remained consistent are the deep worries expressed by the anesthesiologists and other members of the medical community about whether the prisoners really are going to be unconscious during this process. In light of all of this, it's probably unsurprising to you, given what I was saying earlier about the way in which we now understand the cruel and unusual clause of the Eighth Amendment, to find out that lethal injection, in fact, has been challenged at the Supreme Court level. And although the Supreme Court ruled that lethal injection was not cruel and unusual, was in fact constitutional, various states have begun contemplating bringing back other methods of execution, making them the de facto method, like firing squad. And in April of 2015, in the wake of the highly publicized botched execution of Clayton Lockett, Oklahoma again became the leader in establishing a new method of execution, as yet untried, nitrogen-induced hypoxia. We obviously could continue talking about this a great deal. If we were to continue talking about capital punishment, we would get into issues about deterrence, recidivism, innocence, and all sorts of really fascinating topics that have been explored by philosophers, criminologists, sociologists, and economists. But what I want to close now with is a question that's actually been asked on a Gallup poll. Namely, apart from your opinion on capital punishment in general, it's a rather broad topic, which of the methods that I've just talked about do you consider to be the most humane? And what I would advocate for you here is not just to think about this, again, not just to think about this in the abstract, but to think about it in the concrete. If you were the executioner, which of the methods would you be most comfortable or perhaps least uncomfortable carrying out? If you were the prisoner, which of these methods would you most desire or least undesire to have carried out on you? In some cases, we know the answers to those questions. Ronnie Lee Gardner actually requested firing squad. He wanted to be killed by firing squad, not by any other method. In other cases, we don't know the answers to those questions. If you were a family member of the victim and you went to witness this execution, which of these methods would you most desire to see carried out? If you were a family member of the person who is being put to death, of the prisoner, which of these would you want carried out on your brother or sister or whomever? Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. We're supposed to be out of here by 11:30. I know some of you may have to get on to the next class, but we've got a little bit of leeway. Some will let us go till about 11:45 or so. A little bit more time for questions. So I'll field questions again. Raise your hand. I'll put you in the queue. Who's first?
We didn't have a nice dilemma at the end. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what the justification is supposed to be for the unusual part of the cruel and unusual clause, or how unusual is supposed to be understood there? I'm just thinking about it a little bit. Just off the top of my head, it's not obvious why, especially the way you frame things at the end. If I'm thinking about, how would I want to be executed if I had to be executed, or would I want my brother to be executed, or whatever. It doesn't seem like the unusualness of the procedure would really have any bearing on my decision.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't care that much.
Maybe I'm just missing what the justification is supposed to be. Or maybe it's just a historical accident.
So here's one way in which it's being used, especially in the modern period. So one of the things that is often sort of glossed over is that the list of capital crimes hasn't been static, right? So in the colonies, things like bestiality and witchcraft, those were capital crimes. These obviously aren't capital crimes today. But it wasn't so long ago in the United States that armed robbery and rape were considered capital crimes. One of the ways in which the unusual part of the cruel and unusual clause of the Eighth Amendment has been used is to say, well, okay, is it really unusual for us to put to death people who commit armed robbery? Maybe it is. If so, then there might be grounds for saying that it's in violation of the Eighth Amendment. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Thank you. I didn't make that clear enough.
How expensive is lethal injection compared to the other methods?
Really good question. So when it comes to expense, we have to factor in not only the cost of the drugs and the cost of time for the execution team, but also startup costs. So something like gas chamber, the sodium cyanide tablets and the sulfuric acid are relatively cheap, but the gas chamber itself costs in the tens of thousands of dollars. So that's quite expensive. If you were to do a ranking of these in terms of cost, gas chamber is probably the most expensive if you factor in startup costs, then electrocution, then lethal injection, hanging and firing squad. It's sort of unclear. I mean, the rope for hanging costs $1, maybe that. If that, the bullets for the firing squad cost, 5 cents. I guess firing squad probably would be more expensive than hanging because, as I understand it, they give the volunteers the guns at the end of it, so they have to buy new guns each time. So, if you want to get into the details like that, yeah. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, one of the issues that it's been raised a lot in the modern period is the cost of capital punishment. The big thing that's driving up the costs of capital punishment are, one, the costs of the trials themselves. Probably the most notorious person killed under federal jurisdiction in the modern period was Timothy McVeigh. It's estimated the cost of his trial was $100 million, $80 million for the prosecution, $20 million for the defense. The other thing, really big thing driving up the cost of capital punishment is the appeals process. The average time between sentencing and execution these days is more than 10 years. If you went back to the colonies, it was 2 weeks. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with the appeals process. The reason for having the appeals process in place is that the state has an overwhelming interest in ensuring that there are no miscarriages of justice when it comes to the death penalty, because you can't go back with that. The appeals process had problems prior to the modern period. There were people who were taking advantage of it, it seems. But in the modern period, those problems were exacerbated because it's only since Gregg in 1976 that the appeals process became automatic. There are some states, but very few, where the prisoner actually is allowed to waive his or her rights to that appeal. In most cases, even if the prisoner doesn't want to have an appeal, that appeal starts. Yeah. Good question. Sorry, I mattered on too long.
So, we're talking about different methods of carrying out capital punishment, and I just wanted to wonder whether you knew as a factual matter, or whether at any given time in a particular state there are multiple methods being used. And
Being used, yes.
when is it decided, and on what basis is it decided for a particular prisoner that a particular method is used? I think about things like severity of the crime, and so then you get a ghoulish method. How is that decision made? Is it made by a judge? Is it made at sentencing?
Really good question. So in the modern period, nowadays, the clauses tend to be something like this. If lethal injection is ruled unconstitutional on Eighth Amendment grounds, then we're going to use the gas chamber, or something like that. And the other kind of clause is, if the prisoner requests this, then she or he can be executed by this method. Those are the two kinds of clauses in the modern period. Prior to the modern period, it was more sort of, it was sometimes a sort of, well, this fits the crime, right? So one of the instances in which somebody was burned alive was because that person had committed arson. Yeah. Good question, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Diffusion of responsibility. Yeah. So. Mm.
And of course, such a thing is present law that if you only have one executioner.
Sure. Yeah, Yeah, it absolutely does, and there are states that carry out lethal injection with just one executioner, and of course with the electric chair, it's usually just the state electrician. That's the official title, the person who throws that switch at the end. I don't think I would want to defend the rationality of all of these practices. One of the things that is somewhat maybe jarring, maybe frustrating, maybe a little bit of both for philosophers when they start reading these Supreme Court decisions, at least this was my experience, is that they often or sometimes contradict themselves within the same opinion. Weems versus United States is an instance of this. They say at the beginning of the opinion, well, look, the Philippine Constitution has a clause against cruel and unusual punishment. It was copied from the American clause. Therefore, the writers of it must have meant whatever the American writers meant. The American writers should be interpreted ahistorically. So they seem to be saying, okay, we interpret this one historically and this one ahistorically. That seems a little odd. So there do seem to be some, at least prima facie, tensions in all of these things. But again, I guess maybe the idea is something like there's a sort of recognition that it's difficult to be the person who has to carry out these procedures. If you listen to interviews of executioners, they often say things like, I feel like I've been marked in some way. Not entirely clear what that means. Maybe it's just this sort of feeling when you're walking through society that, eyes are on you or you're sort of different in some way. And I guess the idea is to try to minimize that. And for the same reason, they offer psychological counseling generally. I think they actually require psychological counseling for the people who participate in these procedures. So maybe the idea is, even if we recognize that there is a justification for carrying these things out, at the non-cognitive level, there's still the human side of things, which makes it difficult. Yeah.
We should probably stop there. Join me in thanking
Thank you.